My dad handed my pampered sibling a hefty $120,000 for medical school, yet he wouldn't provide any financial support for my company. Now, they're pleading for cash, insisting my brother's life is at risk. To give you some context, I should probably give you a little background on my family first, so everything clicks. I'm a 21-year-old male, and sadly, I grew up in a fractured household. My parents split when I was going through middle school, all because my father had an affair with his assistant. Obviously, it took me a while to find out, only learning about it as I became older. However, the issues in my parents' marriage had always been brewing. Even as a kid, I could sense the underlying stress that was always present. They were together, but I could tell their love was not genuine and something was undeniably wrong. When I saw other parents with their kids, it was obvious that they were a joyful family, but that wasn't the dynamic in my house. Also, I have an older brother, and you'd think that coming from a broken home would have brought us closer, but that didn't happen. Sadly, my brother is a total creep, and for some reason, he's always seemed to have it out for me. Ever since we were children, he always tried to make me feel bad and relentlessly picked on me. This caused our parents to take sides too. My mother usually stood by me, while my dad consistently backed my brother. My brother Eric, who was 25 at the time, was a truly awful person, and growing up alongside him was an absolute nightmare. He was the most unkind child you could imagine, and he'd jump at any chance to gang up on me with his buddies. I was significantly smaller than him, even in stature, so my only option was to run and seek help from my mom. Consequently, I got the reputation as a mama's boy, which was terrible. My mother would always scold him for his behavior, but it was pointless since my father always backed him up. My dad would tell my mom that I needed to toughen up, as that's the only way I'd learn to be a man. But I didn't want to become a man in that sense. All I desired was to live without conflict. It felt like my dad and brother despised the thought of me finding any sort of tranquility in my life. They were constantly trying to antagonize me in some way or another. My mom would try to shield me, but she had her limitations. She couldn't possibly keep us under constant supervision while also managing the whole house. Being a stay-at-home mom, she was incredibly busy caring for us and maintaining the household, so it was tough for her to always step in and stop my brother or dad from picking on me. It was just the way it was when I was a kid. As I got older, I eventually got used to it, preferring to shrug it off instead of always grumbling or resisting it. Then, when I was in the 8th grade, my mom sat me down and told me that she and my dad were separating, and I was old enough at that point to understand that they had their own reasons, and that this was the right thing to do. She didn't tell me the specific reason for the divorce, but I figured that it had to be because my dad was a terrible person to be married to, and she simply couldn't take it anymore, which is why she was going to leave. It wasn't until much later, during high school, that I learned the true reason why she had left. I discovered that my mom had seen text messages on my dad's phone between him and his secretary, and that was the breaking point for her, since she had already put up with a lot, but couldn't deal with his unfaithfulness. We were having a very intimate conversation that day, and she shared that the reason my dad never seemed to like me was because he hadn't even wanted another child in the first place. However, she refused to give me up and even threatened him with a divorce. He was just starting his business at the time, and they were tight on cash. Finances were already tight, with bills piling up, and raising one child was already a drain on their resources. Another child would be a real challenge. However, Mom was resolute, and she insisted that she wouldn't give me up and was absolutely going to see the pregnancy through. They actually did have a babysitter then, because even though Mom worked before I came along, she suggested that she keep working and simply borrow money from my dad. My grandpa, that is, until my dad's business became successful, then they would pay everything back. Yet my dad wasn't comfortable with taking money from his father-in-law, so he informed Mom that the only way he'd agree to a second child was if she quit her job and stayed home. He figured Mom would object to this and end the pregnancy, but she didn't. And that's how things began to go downhill between them. Mom recognized that both of them could have handled the situation better, but the way Dad began to resent me and hurt me after I was born was awful for her, and that's why she never even considered trying to make amends with him. She explained that the fact that my childhood was so awful was partially her responsibility, and apologized to me for it because she felt she should have left sooner but didn't, since she thought it would negatively affect us. Sadly, remaining in that marriage is what made things much more difficult, and in the end, she had to leave, but only after being deeply wounded. And a part of her still has feelings for my dad, even after I was born and he had started treating me really badly. She had held on to the possibility that he might change, but that never materialized, and she was just let down again and again. So the space between them just widened, and ultimately he cheated. I adore my mother, I truly do, but I honestly believe that she could have been candid with me about a lot of stuff much earlier than she decided to be. Because she only told me about all of this when I was a senior in high school, yet they had already divorced back when I was in middle school, and sadly, I had to spend every weekend with my dad. My parents had agreed on a custody setup where I would spend weekends with my dad, and my brother would spend weekends with my mom. That plan succeeded because I absolutely loathed being around my father, and I detested my brother even more. So I made it crystal clear during the divorce proceedings that I refused to be with my dad at the same time as my brother. It was a recipe for pure disaster. Mom was on board, so she instructed her attorney to hammer out the specifics. And even though Dad wasn't thrilled, since he thought it was crucial for me to connect with my brother, I thought it was completely out of the question to connect with someone I saw as a terrible person. Thankfully, my mom had my back and arranged a schedule where I only had to spend the minimal amount of time possible with my dad and my brother, and I primarily grew up with her. Even so, we would still get together for the holidays, and those were always awful because, after his divorce, my brother started dating his secretary, and my mother couldn't stand it. He was smart enough never to bring her around when we gathered for the holidays, but Mom knew about it, and it really bothered her. As a result, the holidays were always uncomfortable, but we somehow had to endure them because my dad wanted it that way, and Mom had to go along with it because she had already separated me, my brother, and Dad. And this was the absolute least she could do so we could still fake the fact that we were a family and connected by blood. That's how we'd pretend to be friendly, even though it was only a facade. Honestly, we didn't truly care for each other, and my brother and I each favored a specific parent. Our parents also played favorites, which wasn't fair at all. Consequently, I suppose it's fair to call my family messed up, and I experienced a very odd upbringing. Despite this, I still kept contact with my father. This continued even after I discovered the reality of the situation during my senior year of high school. My mom had explained that he was supposedly financing my college education, so I needed to maintain a positive relationship with him. That's also why she'd never mentioned these things before. She worried I'd argue with him and lose my college money. My mom only began working after the divorce. She hadn't accumulated enough savings to cover the cost of the type of university I wanted to attend, so my father was my only real possibility. It was seriously tough, but I gave it my all to stay on his good side. However, it all proved pointless in the end. Apparently, I never actually had a college fund, and my dad kept treating me poorly and being condescending. Around 2 months before my graduation date, my friends and I chose to launch our own company rather than go to university. This was a big gamble, considering we were all just 18 years old and lacked much experience, yet we were genuinely enthusiastic about our idea. We didn't believe that college would accelerate our path to success. Instead, it was a step of faith we had to embrace. The idea to start our own business originated with me, and though we initially joked about it, we quickly became certain that this was our path. We decided on a clothing and accessories business because we wanted to change the game, given that most stores in our area offered either mass-produced items from large companies or small businesses that didn't seem to understand what teenagers wanted. It had been tough for my friends and me to find clothes that reflected our true selves. We found ourselves wearing either hand-me-downs we had to buy used, or outfits that made us look like our fathers. I've been tossing the idea around with others, but we realized a bunch of people our age might have similar thoughts, and that's how our company got started. I'm pleased to say we've grown quite a bit since then, and I'm happy I took that leap without going to college because I think we've done all right. Me and 3 of my buddies spent months kicking ideas around and eventually crafted a business plan. It was pre-decided that the 2 of us would work on the clothing designs, which wouldn't be too tough, since most of us were already decent at art and things like that, and had an interest in fashion. The other 2 were going to concentrate on the business side of it. So I was supposed to start hunting down potential investors, which was going to be tough since we were just a group of 18-year-old kids with next to no real-world experience and no college diplomas to our names. We didn't have a fashion degree, and neither did we have a business degree, All we had was our drive and enthusiasm. It sounds a bit naive, but we were determined and had already made a firm decision. For a bit, I kept this whole thing under wraps, but then I couldn't keep it from my mom anymore, so I shared the whole thing with her. Initially, she felt a little uneasy, pushing me to go to college and get a diploma, but I explained I was truly committed to this path, and I simply wanted her backing. Eventually, she came around, but she warned me that convincing my dad to help financially would be a challenge because he already disapproved of men engaging in activities typically seen as feminine. She believed that if he found out I was getting involved in the fashion world, he might never speak to me again. However, I needed funds, and my friends and I were getting turned down by every potential investor we approached. A majority of them wouldn't even sit down for a meeting before dismissing us, and it made sense. Nobody wanted to take a chance on us. The only folks who would even consider backing our business were friends and family, and I realized that fast. Consequently, around 2 months prior to my expected graduation date, I decided to ask my father about money for my company. My friends had already approached their parents, and everyone, despite a great deal of persistence and begging, agreed to put money into our business and assist us. However, my dad would be the most difficult to persuade, and I was fully aware of it. Naturally, I had to start by telling him I hadn't applied to any universities because my friends and I had started working on our own brand. That's what we wanted to pursue, and that's what I needed my college savings for. The first time I mentioned to him that I wasn't going to pursue higher education, he acted completely indifferent, assuring me he was okay with whatever choices I made. However, the moment I explained that I'd need the money from my college fund to get my business venture off the ground, he revealed he hadn't saved any for me. He was entirely sincere, I'm not exaggerating, in his lack of concern for my plans. That's when I realized I didn't even have a college fund to start with. Everything he possessed had already been spent on my older brother, who was attending medical school. I was aware my brother had begun his studies 4 years before me, and I knew medical school was costly. Still, I believed my father's business was thriving, so I assumed he'd be able to support both my brother and me through college. What I didn't understand was that my brother wasn't just using my dad's money for tuition. He was also receiving substantial financial support to enjoy a lavish lifestyle, despite his supposed focus on becoming a physician, and my dad was delighted to provide it. He explained that he had issued my brother a check around the time he started medical school, essentially giving him all of his life savings, the money he'd accumulated over the years. It was an enormous sum, close to $120,000, and he'd simply handed it all over. Ever since, he'd been relying solely on his income, and he was completely content with that situation. I knew he'd figured I wouldn't be going to college, and honestly, he was correct. But his reasoning was completely off, which is why he'd never bothered to put any money away for me, or even tell me that I didn't have a college fund. He told me that day that he simply thought Eric was the smarter son, and he'd never imagined someone as unintelligent as me would even want to attend college, let alone get accepted. And as it turned out, I'd confirmed his assessment by not even applying and deciding to start a business. That, apparently, was exactly what he'd always anticipated from me. I initially thought he was joking or something, but after a few minutes I understood he was serious, and he'd actually given all of his life savings to Eric to use. And he had nothing for me. I completely lost it with him because it wasn't just the fact that he'd neglected to save anything for me. He'd also called me stupid while calling Eric bright. That day, I just let everything out and told him what I really thought because I couldn't handle it any longer. I had hoped he'd help me out, even a little bit, and I would have repaid him when my business started making money. But he couldn't even do that much for me because he was just so self-centered and disliked me so much. I was absolutely heartbroken because even though I'd always known my dad favored Eric and didn't really care for me, this was something I hadn't expected. The day of that huge argument with my dad was essentially the final time we exchanged words. I didn't feel I had anything left to communicate after that. We had really laid everything out on the table during the disagreement, and there was nothing more to say. I made the choice to cut ties and never see my father again, and he seemed okay with it because he knew that no matter what, I wasn't going to become like my brother, Eric. Following that, I essentially just moved in with my mom, which meant I had to disappoint my friends by informing them that my dad wouldn't be funding our business venture, although they were understanding. My mom was a huge help. She gave me some of her own money and borrowed the rest from my grandparents, which wasn't ideal as they are elderly, and I'd wanted them to keep that money available for medical emergencies or things like that. They were happy to get involved as both investors and advisors, and I'm grateful that they decided to invest in me. I think they're also pleased with their decision since our company is doing wonderfully, and we're making as much profit as possible. We're quite well liked among young people, and it's hard to comprehend how much effort it took to get here or just how far we've come, but it's definitely true. I'd say my company is much more successful than my father's, and I imagine that must have been really hard for him to accept. 2 weeks ago, something bizarre occurred, and my father, after nearly 3 years of silence, reached out to me. To my surprise, this call centered around Eric, and he had some distressing news to share. He began by offering his congratulations regarding the achievements of my company. I hoped he might finally admit he'd been incorrect in the past, but instead he told me they needed assistance. He explained that Eric had finished his residency not long ago, but he was now facing severe problems. Apparently, Eric had started gambling while living away from home, and my father had only recently discovered that he was deeply in debt. It wasn't a minor sum. It was a substantial amount, and people were actively searching for him because he owed them a lot of money. Eric was forced to return home within days of completing his residency, and he's currently hiding with my dad. However, that alone wouldn't be sufficient because, eventually, he'd be located. Supposedly, the individuals Eric was involved with were somewhat perilous, and my dad was worried something awful might happen to him. This is where I enter the picture. He stated that he needed me to provide them with a loan to cover their debt so they could get a fresh start. My dad, whose income is solely from his salary, expects me to assist them financially. Because my company is flourishing, he seems to believe that it may not be as big a challenge for me, unlike what he's facing. That was all he uttered. He didn't apologize for what happened before and acted like we'd always been on good terms. There wasn't even a trace of regret in his voice, and it truly infuriated me, as he simply assumed I'd lend them a hand just because he'd reached out to me. So I became extremely angry, and I essentially told him to go try his luck with other people and plead for assistance, because it was foolish of him to expect anything from me. After that, I hung up and blocked his phone number. Following that, I received a couple of calls from a number I didn't recognize, and I assumed it must have been my brother. Thus, I blocked that one as well, ensuring they couldn't contact me at all. It's been a fortnight since then, yet I still haven't managed to get rid of this guilt, and I feel truly awful at this moment. In reality, since blocking them, I've been experiencing some very strange emotions about my choice not to assist them, even though I had the financial capability to do so. It seems like I still have the chance to do the right thing by them, but I'm unsure if they actually merit it, and I'm truly bewildered about what action to take right now. Did I do the wrong thing by refusing to assist my brother when my father wouldn't provide funding for my company 3 years back, especially considering he had already spent all his money on my brother? I'm giving a status update. Hey everyone. I'm truly grateful for the feedback, and I've made up my mind to mull this over for a few more days and consider my options instead of letting my feelings dictate my actions. Until now, I hadn't mentioned it to my mom because I didn't want to upset her. She had distanced herself from my dad and Eric around the same time that I stopped communicating with them, but I know she's also concerned about my brother. She can't help it. She's a mother. I was aware that if I told her my brother was in financial trouble, it would make her really nervous. However, I just had to discuss this with her, so I told her everything, and to my surprise, she agreed that I shouldn't have to help them because they had never looked out for me or stood by me. Things would be different if my dad and brother had said sorry to me for how they treated me throughout my life, but they didn't even bother with that, which was the absolute least they could do. So I really had no reason to feel bad for them because Eric created this problem for himself, and now he could deal with it. Mom mentioned she'd be concerned if he were much younger, but he's in his early 20s, so it's not like he was naive to the situation. He made a mistake. My father facilitated it by pushing him towards his absolute worst tendencies, so now the two of them can fix the problem. I considered that to be sound advice, although I'm currently uncertain about what I want to do. I'm going to keep mulling it over, but to be honest, my mom's got a valid perspective. It's money I worked hard for, and I don't want to just give it to someone struggling with gambling. Plus, I'm not even positive they were being honest with me. Perhaps it was just a fabricated tale to try and get money from me. Frankly, I wouldn't be shocked, because when everything's considered, I've achieved way more success than they anticipated, and I'm sure that's tough for them to swallow. So, naturally, they'll probably try their best to mess things up for me. Yesterday, I felt I needed to investigate things thoroughly so I could figure out what was happening and avoid that constant feeling of guilt, knowing I might be letting my family down. I'm aware they'd done some crummy things to me in the past, yet because I have a tendency toward overthinking, I really just needed reassurance that nothing terrible was going to befall them. If something awful did happen, I'm not sure I'd be able to forgive myself, and I'd feel completely responsible. Thus, I figured I'd go see them and get the lowdown. I drove over to my dad's place, but to my shock, I learned that they had already sold the house about 21 days prior, and a new family was living there now. After talking to the neighbors, I found out that the house had been up for sale for roughly a month. It seemed that the realtor had made a huge sale, and my dad had come into a considerable chunk of cash, because the house they had been living in was reportedly in a really valuable location right now. However, the sale was weeks old, and Dad had already received his money when he phoned me. Therefore, I was puzzled as to why he would still ask me for funds. I was totally bewildered, completely lost, until I got a phone call this morning from my father's attorney. He informed me that I was going to be omitted from my father's will because, supposedly, I had failed the test he'd set for me. Believe me, you're hearing that correctly. They weren't actually in any genuine danger, but my dad was just checking to see if I'd support them. He was planning to include me in the inheritance based on my response. He had already sold the house because he was relocating to live with Eric. Eric had just completed his residency, and since he wanted to finish all the loose ends before he moved away, he devised this whole little test for me. I can't even wrap my head around the kind of messed up thought process that leads someone to think this is an okay thing to do. Honestly, I'm relieved that I failed his little game. I truly don't need his money. He could just vanish from the planet tomorrow and I wouldn't give a rip. I had been putting in so much care and effort in the previous couple of weeks, and it didn't get me anywhere. So no more of that nonsense. Goodness, it still blows my mind how utterly insensitive and crazy the two of them continue to be. I figure some people just can't change, and they believe everything centers around them. I'm just grateful that the business is thriving. I likely won't have to depend on any inheritance for the rest of my life, as long as the business keeps growing at this pace. The puzzle's been figured out, so I don't have anything to fret about anymore. Honestly, it's a little depressing because if something real does come up, I might not even believe it. I have to say, they are just utterly ridiculous. This is update number 3, hello. This one is coming almost a year after the last one, and I'm thrilled to share that I'm engaged. I found my future wife last year, and I realize it's pretty quick to get engaged after only being together for a year, but you know what people say, when it's right, it's just right. Plus, I've known my fiancée since we were kids. She moved away for a while, but she's back now, which is how we got back in touch last year and started dating almost right away. We didn't want to waste any more time. However, this update isn't actually about her, as much as I'd love to keep talking about it. It's more about how my dad and my brother reacted to the engagement news. For some reason, they decided to email me and let me know that even though they were happy for both of us, they wouldn't be at the wedding. They said they thought it wouldn't be proper for them to be there, since the host doesn't like them. So they sent their best wishes, but they will not be at any of the wedding stuff. My mom, my fiancé, my friends, and basically everyone I know saw that email because I forwarded it to them, and we all had a good laugh about it. They really had a lot of nerve to think they'd be included, yet it's amusing that they're exactly the same, still believing they're the center of everything. I can say for sure that it's amusing, at least.